Hello and welcome to this video. I want to talk about the Section C essay for the Political and Social Protest Writing paper with AQA. The aim of this video is to work with one question to show you what an example Section C response looks like. Worth bearing in mind, of course, that you'll be using two texts for this, and each school and college will select different texts. So for this video, I'm going to be using, I believe it's A Doll's House and William Blake's poetry, Songs of Innocence and of Experience. But again, the essay structure is the same across any text. Even though you're dealing with two texts, there's no need to compare them. It's an open book exam, so you will have clean copies of the texts in front of you. What I want to show you really are some of the misconceptions of English Lit, which is that because you're writing an essay, you have to have an introduction and a conclusion. That's not necessarily the case, particularly for Section C. And of course, it is open book, so you've got to avoid the temptation of being distracted by that. Looking for a quote in a novel that's 250,000 words, for example, is going to be like looking for a needle in a haystack. And before you know it, you've wasted time trying to find that quote. So remember that an open book exam is nice, but it can also be a distraction, and don't spend too much time looking for information. Um, Another temptation with an open book exam is that you quote a lot because you've got them all in front of you. And again, that's not necessarily the case. Quoting too much can actually increase lack of clarity into your writing, which you don't want. You want to have a strong, convincing, confident voice. And if you're quoting a lot, it can sometimes take that away. So even though you have the text in front of you, please quote um, sparingly and short quotes as well. You don't have to include so many quotes. Nowhere in the mark scheme does it say students have to quote X number of times. It's for you to decide. So the question we're going to look at is a question, like I said, that came up about 3 or 4 years ago, all about the failure of institutions. And for this video, I'm going to be using Ibsen's A Doll's House and Blake's poetry. So the introduction is this first couple of lines, and that's it. The problem sometimes with introductions is that because they are an introduction, students don't really say anything. They introduce. And if you have a paragraph, a large paragraph, where you're just introducing but not really saying anything, that's going to be a waste of time, and it's also going to limit the amount of marks you get. So it's far better to actually write a very short introduction if you're going to write one, and then go straight into your first text. So it says a common element of political and social protest writing is the presentation of failing institutions. This can be seen in both A Doll's House and Blake's poetry. In Ibsen's naturalist prose drama from 1875, the claustrophobic setting of the family home is significant in the presentation of the failing institution of marriage. The oppressive atmosphere of the home and the way in which Nora is consistently caged within the front room of the property acts as a metaphor for Ibsen to criticise the suffocating institution of marriage, particularly in relation to married mothers. Ibsen said himself, "A woman cannot be herself in modern society," suggesting that this is clearly a feminist text. As Nora's secrets and lies become intensified as the play develops, relating to the borrowing of money and associated deceptions, the atmosphere of the home becomes increasingly claustrophobic, culminating in her anagnorisis, where she decides to reject Helmer and marry life in favour of self-governance. The significance placed on marriage as an institution is reinforced through Helmer's speech in Act 3. There is repetition of the phrase sacred duties, alluding to what a woman's priority should be. Helmer believes that she is first and foremost a wife and mother, rejecting any notion that she has her own spirit and independence. Nora believes that she has duties to myself, and that I believe I am first and foremost a human being, suggesting that she is trying to assert some equality with her husband, who represents a dominant force within the domestic sphere of this play. In fact, Hamlet is so dismissive of his wife's perspective that he dismisses valid points that she presents, opting to say she must be feverish or quite ill, implying that the rigid roles of men and women in marriage have made him unable to, and unprepared to see Nora's point of view, which in her eyes has been a facade for 8 years, where she has played the role of his doll wife. In the end, Nora leaves the home in the quest to foreground her own emotional and intellectual growth as a new woman. This shows her desire to democratically emancipate herself from the house, symbolic of breaking free from the dogmatism of marriage more widely, arguably leaving Helma as the doll in the house after the door slams at the end. As a result, in Ibsen's play, the failure of the institution of marriage and its insistence on the creation of binary gender roles is responsible for a lot of what the audience witnesses on stage, and is ultimately responsible for the breakdown of the Helma's marriage. So, an anagnoresis is an epiphany, that light bulb moment where she thinks, I've had enough of this, I'm off. So, just some definition there. So that's the paragraph about A Doll's House. They have not tried to put Blake in the same paragraph, they've kept it separate. So now they're done with A Doll's House and they can move on to Blake. And in this essay, the student decides to write about 2 poems in about half an hour, because you've got an hour for this task, half hour for A Doll's House, half hour for Blake, maybe. So split it in half. In Blake's poetry, the failure of institutions is also a main theme, particularly in Songs of Experience, which acts as the juxtaposition to the idealism seen in the Innocence collection. One poem which presents the failure of the church is The Garden of Love, an ironic title considering it has connotations of Eden and equilibrium with nature, yet in the poem it is anything but. The poem is just one example of how Blake can be seen as a social commentator with a deep-seated anti-establishment ideologue, appalled and outraged by the failures of institutions who perpetuate suffering and do little to prevent it while wielding power over individuals. In the poem, a speaker laments at how a chapel was built in the midst of a once green field where the speaker used to play as a child. The chapel is capitalized because this one building is in the microcosm of this field represents the broader institution of the church nationwide. In the second stanza, the speaker states that the gates of this chapel were shut, suggesting that the church is only interested in serving its own interests and is detached from the public, as well as more interested in being a dogmatic presence instead of a charitable one. This is represented by the Ten Commandments writ over the door, which present a barrage of rules and regulation before entering. The flowers that used to grow have been replaced with graves, which metaphorically depicts the burial of freedom, pleasure, and love, in favour of priests in black gowns walking their rounds, which is indicative of surveillance and morality being policed. As is so often the case in Blake's work, nature and the pastoral are often used metaphorically to depict a particular state, whether that be harmony and utopia in innocence, or suffering and dogmatism in experience. So you'll notice that this is not about filling your analysis with lots of complex poetry terminology. It's actually unnecessary in literature. The most important thing is you've answered the question, and you're talking about the text, and you've in a confident way. And there are methods in there without actually naming devices. So authorial methods are important, yes, but that doesn't just mean you have to go around listing devices. That's unnecessary. And the essay finishes by talking about the schoolboy. Another poem that presents the failure of an institution is The Schoolboy, which is interested in depicting the failures of the education system, whether, rather than fostering the love of learning, becomes a monotonous punishment for the children who must endure it. The first stanza depicts the equilibrium and sweet company the child speaker has with nature. The birds sing on every tree, suggesting a sense of jubilation and freedom associated with the green world and the bucolic pastoral. However, the fronted conjunction but at the start of the second stanza depicts a change in mood, as the child must reject this freedom and harmony in favour of going to school, which drives all joy away, because the little ones spend the day in song and dismay. The semantic field of misery is evident throughout the poem. Words such as cruel, sighing, dismay, drooping, anxious, dreary, and fears reinforce Blake's apathy towards a rigid and prison-like form of education as mitigating freedom, metaphorically shown through the rhetorical question, how can the bird that is born for joy sit in a cage and sing? At the end of the poem, the reference to nipped buds and tender plants are stripped, suggests that Blake is likening the erosion of children's creativity and free spirit to harsh winters that can destroy young buds, and in so doing, impact negatively on the future harvest. In other words, the children's dogmatic education will do nothing but harm, preparing them for the bleakness, suffering, and exploitation they may face in the more dystopian world of experience, represented in this poem through the phrase blasts of winter. And then we've got a conclusion. As a result, Ibsen's play focuses on the failure of the institution of marriage, whereas Blake focuses on the failure of the church and the education system. And that's the conclusion, that's it. You don't want to spend a long time on conclusions because it's basically repeating yourself, and that's not going to get you marks. So that is an example of a section C response in which you've got an hour to write it. The number of poems is down to you. You might want to talk about 1 poem, 2 poems, 3 poems. By the time you get to 4 poems, I would suggest you're pushing your luck in terms of time. So don't bite off more than you can chew. Okay. Notice as well that I'm being very selective in terms of what bits of the poems I'm talking about. There is no obligation to talk about every single stanza, every single quote. You're not going from top to bottom of the poem, actually, because that's sometimes unnecessary and it wastes time. You're choosing the bits of the texts that you think best fit the question, because you are discussing the question using the texts as a support, really, to do so. Okay, so that's an example of a Section C response for political and social protests using Blake and A Doll's House. Hopefully that was useful, and good luck in your studies. Thank you.